If you'd like to turn in your Bibles to James chapter 2. James chapter 2. Really appreciated Greg's thoughts from the cross this morning. I can't remember if it was last week or a couple weeks ago that Bart was up here. And Bart talked about the individual side of communion, about this between you and God side of communion. And then Greg today covered the us part of communion. And I think it's just kind of a neat thing that God has provided us with this way to remember that also connects us all with each other and with Him. And there's just an incredible wisdom that comes in that. I hope you gain from those thoughts and from what we do together as we remember. Also, we'll mention, by the way, it hit me when I got up here and then I forgot why. There's a big gap right here this morning. Our youth group and several families connected with our youth group are over at Hammond Heights this morning for the worship service over there, where my son David is preaching. So a group has chosen a different Lewis this morning, and I will forgive them later for that, but they'll probably have a better sermon over there anyway. It's all good. But glad that they do that, glad to have that connection with Hammond Heights, and we haven't had a lot of that over the COVID times. It's good to get back to that again this morning. All right, we're in James chapter 2 this morning, and we'll begin in verse 14. We'll just jump right in and ask some questions along the way along with James. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? And a lot of people, when they read this verse, will ask the question, did James and Paul contradict? Because Paul says in Romans 3, verse 28, for we hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Okay, so James has said faith and works. Paul says faith apart from law. Do they contradict? And people have written books and blogs and all kinds of preached sermons about this, and there are people that are absolutely convinced one way or the other. I will tell you that a lot of non-Christians, if they know a little bit about the Bible or have read a little bit about the Bible, this is one of those places they will go where they will say the Bible contradicts itself. Because in one place you've got the idea that faith is it, and in the other place you have the idea that faith and works are necessary to work together. And which one is it? And much like, is communion just me and God, or is communion us and God and us and one another? The answer, of course, is yes, it's both. And what we see here is James and Paul talking about faith and works, but talking about two different things. And you'll notice, by the way, that Paul actually talks about faith and law, even though he's talking about keeping the law. It's not the same kind of works that James is talking about. Because what Paul is talking about is things that happen before you are converted. Paul says it is faith that brings you to this salvation. It's not the stuff that you have done that gets you here. And he lived within a culture of people that were having this fight among one another. And if you were here as we studied Galatians several months ago on Wednesday evening, you saw that all unfold with the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians struggling about the place of the old law. And there were those who thought you have to do these things and keep these things to be okay with God. And Paul said, no, it is grace that saves you, not law. And so what Paul is speaking to when he talks about faith and works is what happens before you're converted. What James is talking about is, now that you are followers of Christ, these are things that you do because of that. This is how you change. So again, read James's verse in that context. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Does that faith save him? And so what James talks about is faith and works. The way Jimmy Allen put it when I was a student in his Romans class, because he took on this same topic of do James and Paul contradict? He said we're not saved by faith plus works, we are saved by faith which works. Because if you have faith, it's going to put itself to work in your life. You cannot believe something and not be changed by that belief and then act based on those things that you believe. And so what James would say is, okay, if you have faith, there's going to be something that happens as a result of that. It's not just a statement of belief, it is a way of life that you take on. So what are faith and works? And I believe that's what James is going to answer in the rest of this chapter. And he's going to do it by way of 4 illustrations. And if you've been around me long enough, you know I like illustrations. And so I really like this part of James because James comes at this from 4 different angles, 2 of them negative, 2 of them positive, 2 of them a little more vague as to who the characters involved are, and 2 of them familiar Old Testament characters. But through these 4 things, I think James does a pretty good job of explaining what he means by faith and works and what that should look like in our lives. So first of all, his first illustration is about a brother or sister. And in verses 15 and 16, he says, If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that?" And I like the question he asks here. What good is that? Now, we think here in terms of brother and sister because that's what James lays out for us, but just think even in general terms for a minute. What if we had somebody call the office last week about our food pantry, which is the yellow house next door. If you're not a member here, you can't miss it when you drive by. It is yellow all day long, and there it is. And once a month, people come about 8 o'clock in the morning, and they line up outside the door, and they come in, and we give them food. Food comes, it doesn't just magically appear there, by the way. A group of people goes and gets food that is delivered by the food bank, and they unpack it all and put it all together and get things ready for the yellow house. Could you imagine if I told this person on the phone, we have the yellow house that's happening on this day, which is what I said, and you are welcome to come. We'll be here at 8 in the morning, and you can come get food. What if they showed up, they lined up like they do every month at the Yellow House, some people for the first time, some people for month after month. They get to the door, we open the door, they come in, they tell their name, and we say, "Good luck to you." And they just kind of look at us for a minute, and we look at them, and they're waiting for the moment where the food comes their way, and whoever's sitting there at the table taking all the intake stuff says, "Can I help you with something else?" And the person says, "Well, food. We came here for food." And they said once again, well, good luck with that. We hope you find food. How crazy would that be? What a strange thing would that be? And would you begin to hear the murmur making its way down the line of people who are lined up out front waiting for food? James says if you have faith and this situation happens, what do? And that's a pretty easy question, I think, for most of us. We try to help out, don't we? We've had struggles within our own church family over the last week, and I've heard multiple accounts of people who have more food than they know what to do with, because that's what churches do when struggles come people's way. Whether it's a loss in the family or a surgery that's going on, people reach out with food. It's one of the things they do. And so there's all this food that comes their way because there is a knowing and there's a doing. So James said, if you just say, "Good luck," what good is that? And then he follows up by answering the question with this. So faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Faith without works is dead. If it is just a belief and nothing happens based on that belief, then there's nothing there. There's nothing that is worthwhile that comes of it. Not that believing is not important. And don't get me wrong here. Believing is very important. But if all it is a belief that doesn't do anything, it doesn't really do any good, does it? And then he carries on with another illustration here. Kind of an odd place to go, I would think, but it does fit the negative. An illustration about demons. So maybe we would think of the two extremes here, brothers and sisters, and then demons. And so James says in verse 18, "But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, and you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder.'" So James says, well, you believe, even the demons do that. We don't like having things in common with demons, do we? That's not one of the places we like to go with our spiritual life. God, we don't sing songs about God make me more like demons. If you believe, you're in the same place that the demons are, although I would argue, based on James's language here, that maybe the demons have better faith than we do at times. Because how did he describe the demons? The demons believe and shudder. How often does our belief in the power of God actually cause us to shudder? I know there are moments that we see the glory of God and the power of God and we're kind of amazed by it, but how often does it make us just kind of jump a little bit? Anybody jump a little bit last night at about midnight, 1 in the morning? There was a storm that blew through, if you're a hard sleeper, and you wondered where all those leaves and branches came from this morning. There was a storm that blew through, literally blew through. 60-mile-an-hour winds, there was some hail here and there, a lot of thunder and lightning. And I will tell you, it still makes me jump a little bit, even as a pretty hard sleeper. I am fearful to some degree of storms. Ironic, I live in Oklahoma, of all places. When I lived in Oregon, by the way, the thing you may not know about Oregon, I saw thunder and lightning. I heard thunder, saw lightning in Oregon. The entire 3.5 years we lived there, I believe 3 times. Imagine what that would be like, by the way. So when I got to Oklahoma, everything changed again really quickly, and we see this all the time. There are things that make us fearful and shudder. I don't know how often God is one of them. I think he should be. I don't think we need to constantly live in fear of God's judgment and what he will do. I think he wants us to be secure in our walk. But at the same time, if we believe that we serve a God who spoke these things into existence, a God who has power over life and death and the world and everything else, there should be a part of us in that belief that would cause us to shudder. And for the demons, it does. But we don't want to be like the demons in that belief. We want something more. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? So first he says it's dead when you don't have faith in works, and now it's useless. And again, when it comes to our walk with God, we don't want to be described as useless, do we? Have you ever described a person as useless or heard a person be described as useless? This is very offensive language in our world nowadays. But you may have had that thought somewhere along the way. You may have described a coworker, or if you're a person in charge, someone that worked for you that way. You have maybe been described that way at some point if you weren't doing what you should be doing well. You've probably seen that unfold in our world. But when it comes to spiritual things with God, of all the ways we would want God to describe us, I would think useless is pretty far down the list of how you'd want to be known by God. And James says, if you believe, the demons do that. There's nothing special there. But if you have faith and not works, that belief is useless. And therefore, you are useless as well. Now, I'm glad things begin to take a turn here, because at this point, I'm feeling pretty rough about stuff. It's very negative, very much, well, is anything good enough, James? And so then James begins with examples. First of all, of Abraham. And to the people whom James writes to, especially the Jewish Christians, there would be no one more familiar to them than Abraham. Everything went back to Abraham and the promise of God. So he says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. So you see the language here. Faith is active with works, and it's completed with works. And we've talked quite a bit already here in the book of James about this idea of being completed. It's perfect in some places, it's completed in others, it's mature in others. If we have a faith that is growing, a faith that is active, a faith that does, that faith is completed through what we do. And you'll notice, by the way, it doesn't say that Abraham was counted righteous because of knowing who God was, because of knowing what God would do, because of believing him, because of having faith. It was in the action. And we know from the story that God stops him before the ultimate action of sacrificing his son, but God knew that is what he was willing to do. Abraham's action was the thing that was commended by God, not just the belief and not just the knowing. Then he says, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So a person is justified by faith and works. It's not just one or the other, it is both. Like so many things in life, it's not one aspect of it that we can pull out, it's both. And we will, for whatever reason, by the way, we will get in arguments with our denominational neighbors over this, about belief in baptism. I don't think this is really what James is talking about here. I know we've used this verse this way at times. It seems to be that James is talking, when he says works, about something that is much more full than just baptism. And our neighbors will argue about whether baptism is a work, and all. We won't get into all of that, but a life of faith is a life that includes all of those things. We do a lot of things because of the faith that we have in Christ. And then he goes to an odd place. I like the two personal examples he chooses, because for religious folks, they are opposite ends of the spectrum. You have Abraham, the father of faith. We've made the silly VBS song out of that nowadays. To the people growing up in this faith, Abraham would have been everything in the covenant of God. And then you have at the complete other end of the spectrum, Rahab the prostitute. You know, if you think that we don't sing songs about being like a demon, God, make us more like a demon. We definitely don't set out to be more like a prostitute. And yet Rahab the prostitute will be used as this incredible example of faith. It says in verse 25 that in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? So in the same way. And so what James is teaching us with these examples is, this is a pattern that can be followed. And we like patterns in church, by the way, don't we? We like things that we can kind of put in a row, and we're going to do these things in this order, and we're going to follow this. Here is a pattern. It is not just Abraham and his action that justifies you by faith. It is not just this example of demons or this example of just a silly, odd way to call out to your brother who is in need, good luck, and I hope that works out for you. These things are a pattern. And so we see not just in Abraham that action along with faith works, we see also in Rahab, someone who was an ungodly person by any means, does the godly thing. And it is this godly action that brings her into contact with the people of God. It is this godly action that justifies her in what she does. For as the body, apart from the spirit, is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Faith without works is dead. And if there's one thing we don't want our faith to be described as, it is dead. We just sang before I got up here this morning about living by faith. We want our faith to be a living and active thing, not something that could even begin to be described as dead. So I want you to consider his examples here in chapter 2. His examples are, first of all, back in 2 verses 8 and 9, non-prejudice. Part of a living, active faith is being people who do not show favoritism, or putting that in a different way, people who are not prejudiced, judgmental against others. And everything within us tends to push us that other way. We like to be around people who are like us. We struggle sometimes with people who are not like us. And immediately, by the way, we will tend to think of categories that we don't struggle with, and so we'll feel like we're doing pretty good at this. But there are, for most of us, some category of people that we begin to struggle with not treating differently, and James understands that. Secondly, he talks about living at peace in verses 10 through 12. He talks about this with the examples of, you've heard about not committing murder and not committing adultery. And so there is nonviolence, and there is the importance of the marital relationship, living at peace with one another. And then third, he talks about helping the poor in the verses that we just read this morning. If there are people there who are in need, what do? What does active faith look like? Active faith looks like, I'm not judgmental against folks. Active faith looks like when there is an opportunity to be peaceful instead of reacting in anger or in violence, I'm going to be peaceful. And active faith looks like that when there is someone who is in need, I'm going to help those people who are in need. And I will challenge you, by the way, what is not described as active faith here in chapter 2? Showing up. I'm glad you're here. I hope you're here next Sunday morning. I hope you're here the Sunday morning after that and the Sunday morning after that. I hope if you're not usually here tonight, that maybe you'll be here tonight. I hope if you're not usually here on Wednesday night, you might be here on Wednesday night too. Showing up is important. But when James takes the time to describe, here is what active faith looks like, this is how he describes it. And this is a challenge to us as Christians, because how do we tend to label people who have a mature, and remember the language he uses, this is how you complete your faith. This is how your faith becomes mature. How do we describe people who are mature and faithful? Well, they're here. They show up. They attend. That tends to be how we describe those people. And not that those things aren't important, but how does James describe it? They are people who do these things. And I'll challenge you one other way. And before we leave this behind, and you can just take this and file it away in your mind. If you were to describe a political party today, looking at these items, which one do you think most people in our culture would pick out? And I will tell you, it's not the one that most people in churches tend to pick out. Now, I say that to say this. If we as Christians were doing these things at the level that James is talking about doing them, this would no longer be a political issue. This would not be something that's connected with one party or another. This would be what Christians do. There would be no more questions about how many more taxes do they have to take out to pay for different programs and things, because Christians would be taking so much care of this, it would not be needed. There are enough Christians in our world today that these things could just be done if we believe this at the level that James is talking about it, and we believed it, as we talked about as we began this morning, with urgency. That God cares so much about us acting out of faith with these things that we are making this a priority in life with what we do. And there are a number of reasons we don't, by the way. I think we have been lulled into the sense of security in America that the government takes care of all of this. Even though we're mad that the government takes care of all this, by the way, we argue about it, but yet we're still okay with it. We get lulled into it with that. We also, by the way, and we'll talk about this tonight and in the coming Sunday nights in July, we struggle with this because of money. we don't have enough money to do these things because our money is tied up in other places. Now, I'm not talking about as a church. I feel like as a church, Southwest is very blessed, does a lot of stuff for a lot of people. Maybe that's another place. We just assume the church as a whole does all this stuff, so I don't have to worry about it. But so many of us have so much tied up in debt and in things we cannot get to, and we have so many bills that we're trying to pay that we don't feel like we can do any of these things financially. And we'll talk quite a bit in Sunday nights about trying to get ourselves to a place where we can do these things, and when we can give, and when we can be better stewards of things, so that we can do all of this. So what if we could live in a world where these things were done to the point that this part of the political argument was gone? There was no longer one party that could hold something over another about these things, because these things are being taken care of in other ways, and we don't have to worry about these things. That is the world that James is talking about. That is the world that God envisions with his church. And then I want you to think for a moment about Hebrews chapter 11. And we will draw this together here. There is this great chapter of faith. All these people that have done all these amazing things we like to look at. They're all our VBS stories. We think about all that stuff. And we talk about it as the chapter of faith, probably at least in part because at the beginning of that chapter we read, by faith. But then what we read is not a description of belief. What we read throughout Hebrews chapter 11 is a description of action. It's a description of works. It's a description of doing. And that by faith has made us call this the faith chapter. I wonder sometimes, do we need to rename this thing the works chapter, the action chapter, the doing chapter? Because what you have is a chapter full of people that because of their faith, because of what James is talking about here in chapter 2, they did things that were unbelievable. And I will tell you, the beauty of that entire chapter is we see all the amazing things that they do. We also see, by the way, as we look at some of those names, some of the other things we know about those people, the flaws they have, the struggles they had, the places they fell short. And what we see is a chapter full of people who are just like you and just like me. I know some of them talk directly with God because that's what was happening at their point in history. I know some of them may have been able to do things that were even at a miraculous kind of level. But when it comes to faith, and faith being in action, we are every bit as capable as the people you read about in Hebrews chapter 11. So when I tell you it's possible there could be a world where governments and political systems don't take care of poor and all of those things because Christians are too busy doing it and there's not a job left to be done, I truly believe that is possible. Now, do I believe it's likely? Not on the course that we're on, because we're on a course that is just doing that the way it's been done, and we'll keep on doing that the way it's been done. But I'm telling you that if all Christians believed this was necessary and urgent and part of faith in action, yes, because of the power of God and because of what he does, it is very much doable for us. So if you think about that for a minute, think about these people of faith. It's not just that they believed, it is they did. They did things in life. Let me ask you this morning, where are you with that? Where are you in your faith? Because I would imagine most of you either believed or someone who believes drug you here this morning, one of the two. What is that belief doing in your life? Because in every other aspect of life, that belief causes you to do. I was trained in first aid several years ago. I have a card in my wallet that I noticed the other day has expired. And I thought, does this mean I can't do first aid anymore? I don't know how this works. I'm no longer legally allowed to do. I still remember how to do CPR. I still remember you're supposed to hum Staying Alive in your head, and that's the right pace and all of that stuff. I still know the right things to do and when to, Butch was talking about tourniquets this morning, when to apply pressure and how all of those things work. And so theoretically, if I come up to a place where there's a need for that, then I am supposed to not just know what to do, I'm supposed to do it. And if there's someone who's a medical professional, I'll get out of their way and let them do it and try to remember how to do it all better. But if it's just me there, I'm going to get up and I'm going to do something about it. What are we doing when it comes to our faith in God? Are we people who are getting up and doing something for God, or are we just assuming that just believing is good enough? Or are we just assuming that just believing and having been baptized whenever we were baptized way back when is good enough? Or are we just assuming that just believing and having been baptized at some point and then showing up here each Sunday morning, that that's enough? And what James tells us in James chapter 2 is, no. It's not that we're doing these things because we're trying to earn something, but because if you have been transformed, if you have been changed, If you are walking a new life with Christ, then you're going to do things as a result of that. And if you're not doing them, this is probably a little more for you than someone who has never followed before. I would ask you to change that today. That may not be a come up here kind of thing, but I think you need to have a talk with God, with people who will hold you accountable and say, I want to be better about not just believing, but about doing. Or if you have never followed, know that this is not just about salvation, although that is unbelievable, and that's something we all want. This is about living in a different way, and in the kind of way that makes your life and the life of everyone around you better. And if you would like that kind of life, you can begin that walk today by confessing his name and being baptized. If there's something we can do for you as your church family to help you walk in faith, please come as we stand and sing.